Support for Disrupted comes from the Connecticut Office of Film, Television, and Digital Media.
In September, the United Nations General Assembly began its 80th session. The UN was founded after World War II, with nations coming together in the hope of avoiding another world war. Later this hour, we look at the status of the United Nations today, including how that status is threatened. But first, we step back in time. The United Nations achieved new prominence in the 1960s as it kept the peace during the Cold War. It grew to include more nations from around the world, and in the 1960s, the United Nations appointed its first non-European Secretary General. His name was U Thant. U Thant was a Burmese diplomat who worked as a school teacher until his 40s. He quickly rose up the ranks after working as Burma's ambassador to the UN, and he served as UN Secretary General from 1961 to 1971. In a 1967 Gallup poll, U Thant was ranked the sixth most admired man in the world. He followed behind Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Bobby Kennedy. His farewell lunch was attended by luminaries like New York Governor Nelson Rockefeller, Jacques Cousteau, and John Lennon. The life of U Thant is the subject of a new book by Thant Myint-U. It's titled Peacemaker, U Thant and the Forgotten Quest for a Just World. Thant Myint-U is an honorary fellow of Trinity College, Cambridge, and a senior fellow at the UN Foundation. He formerly served on 3 UN peacekeeping operations, and he is also U Thant's grandson. Thant, thank you for joining us on Disrupted.
It's a pleasure. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
U Thant was your grandfather, and you write in the book that you spent your earliest years living with him in New York while he was Secretary General. Share with us a little bit about that time. It is not the average childhood for most people. What was that experience like for you?
Yeah, so I grew up until I was about, 5 or 6 years old, living in his house. So it was the UN Secretary General's house, which was in Riverdale, about 20, 30 minutes from Midtown Manhattan. And it was a big house, but it was a mini Burma. We had a lot of Burmese people who were living with us, staying with us, my parents, obviously, and my younger sisters. And he was always around. I mean, he was traveling sometimes, and he was obviously working hard at the UN. But pretty much every evening he would be back. He would, I never talked about diplomacy or politics with him. He was just my grandfather. But I remember sitting on the carpet in his bedroom watching TV shows on his color TV. I remember swimming with him in the pool. I remember him coming back with his briefcase and his top, his overcoat. I just remember him as a normal grandfather at that time. I was 8 years old when he passed away in 1974.
So to have that childhood, that sounds like the childhood we all want, of having that time with an elder, being able to experience all of those everyday moments of childhood. But what I think is also critical for our listeners to know here, you mentioned Burma. Your grandfather was a school teacher and headmaster in Burma until he was almost 40 years old. So a significant time of his professional career helping other children. It is so important to me because he also taught himself English and spent so much time reading extensively, learning, and really committing to doing that work of being globally aware and still planting and investing in education right where he was. Talk to us a little about your grandfather's early time in government service in Burma and how that shaped his path.
Yeah, so it was a very small town that he's from. I've been there, and even now it's pretty remote and pretty poor. But in those days, it would have been, a day's journey from the capital, Rangoon, which was then part of the British Empire. And he was from a well-to-do family, but his family became suddenly impoverished when he was 15, and he had to give up these dreams initially of government service. And as you said, he resigned himself in a way to being a school teacher, but in a way he flourished as a school teacher as well. I think he always saw himself as an educator for the rest of his life after that. And he tried to connect to the rest of the world as best he could, subscribing to every newspaper and magazine he could afford and writing. And it was on the basis of that that the government, when Burma became independent, asked him to join the government service. And then he had this meteoric rise. He was friends then with the prime minister. He traveled the world with him. And within 10 years of having left this little town without electricity, running water, just a bunch of wooden houses and buildings, he was in Midtown Manhattan as Burma's new ambassador to the UN.
To make that journey from Burma to Midtown Manhattan, especially at that time in the 1950s, the mid-1950s in New York City, I imagine could be overwhelming, could be shocking. But one of the things that you write about in this book that reminds us that even with that incredible journey of public service and education, U Thant endured much once he came to New York, that it was not that he was simply accepted as this important leader, that when he and his wife, then Chen, arrived, they had a really difficult time finding housing. And it wasn't just their experience, it was the experience of so many coming from particular parts of the world. What in the book do you write about that experience of finding difficulty with housing and how it may have shaped their approach to being in New York?
Yeah, I mean, in a way, it's a migration story. I mean, he was one of many, hundreds of diplomats from these newly independent countries in Africa and Middle East and Asia that were coming to New York at the time. And almost all of them, or all of them, faced discrimination, especially in housing. And this was, of course, nothing new. I mean, when the UN was first headquartered in New York, so in the late 1940s, they thought initially that they would have what is now Peter Cooper Village as a place where UN staff could live. And they were told by the developers there that no non-white people were allowed. So people like Dr. Ralph Bunche, who was a Nobel laureate already, wasn't allowed to live there and found a home in Queens later on. And for my grandfather, he went to many different places before he was finally accepted as the Burmese ambassador at an apartment on 72nd Street, not too far from the UN. And that was just the beginning of a really difficult relationship with his landlord, who, despite the fact that it was a rent-controlled apartment that was supposed to be $400 a month, was charging him over $2,000 a month. And for many years, he had to struggle with legal fees, with a legal battle with his landlord to get a fair rent or get out of his contract.
Just 4 years after arriving in New York, your grandfather became Secretary General of the United Nations. It followed after the very unfortunate and untimely death of his predecessor in a plane crash during a mission in the Congo. And you write that U Thant was chosen because he, quote, emerged as the only person in the world acceptable to both Moscow and Washington. Why was that the case?
Well, I mean, we tend to think of history around that time as the history of the world wars and the Cold War and the Americans and the Soviets kind of facing off against each other. But for most people in the world, the history of the world was also the history of empire and post-empire. And this was the moment in the 50s, late 1950s, early 60s, that was a turning point. And those countries had become independent. And in a way that was not foreseen by the founders of the UN in 1945, they became a near majority at the UN. And they really felt that, unlike Washington and Moscow, that there was no need for a Cold War, that peace was possible. If decolonization was possible, peace was possible, development was possible, cooperation was possible, and that this was their time. And in a way, both the Americans and the Soviets felt they had to kind of cater to this new emerging movement and block of nations. And everyone decided on U Thant, both as someone who came from that block because they were insisting, countries like Ghana, India, Indonesia, were insisting on one of their own. But to the Americans, U Thant also seemed like someone who was not a radical necessarily and someone who would build bridges. He had developed a reputation as someone who got on with everyone. It was only the Russians that were not so sure about him, so they put him on probation. They agreed, but only that he'd be acting Secretary General for a year in the beginning.
To be thought of as only acting Secretary General for a year, U Thant didn't really have a lot of time or runway to prove himself. And yet, just a year later, not even a full year after being selected, he played this critical role in helping avert war in 1962 because this was the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Tell us the story of your grandfather's leadership during that time.
I mean, even before then, in his first months, he had to deal with this really complex situation in the Congo, where the UN was battling white supremacist networks, mercenaries. And as part of his effort there, he knew that to get what he wanted to do, I mean, to be able to do what he wanted to do, which was to take on these white supremacist forces, he had to build up a good personal relationship with both John F. Kennedy and Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet leader. And so it was serendipitous in a way for the world that when the Cuban Missile Crisis broke out in October of 1962, he already had a good relationship with the two most powerful men in the world. So I think the way in which the Cuban Missile Crisis story is usually told is that the Russians put missiles in Cuba, President Kennedy puts a blockade, the world's on the brink of a nuclear war, and then because President Kennedy is skillful but also tough, the Russians back down. The story that's not told is in the middle of all of this, there was a Burmese mediator who made sure that both men had the space and the time that they needed for diplomacy to take a step back, to take a deep breath and find a compromise solution. My grandfather, I think he felt, even without a mandate from the Security Council or anyone else at the UN, I mean, normally Secretary Generals cannot act on their own, that he had to kind of jump in and that his role was going to be exactly that, to craft the intervention, the series of public messages, secret messages, a trip to Havana to see Fidel Castro, to get all sides to see this as a political crisis and to offer those kind of face-saving ladders to climb down and away from that nuclear brink.
I think the timing of your book is so critical as we think about the many conflicts that are happening around the world right now, as we face this question of what the role should be, not just of the United States, but of others across the world. And the real question becomes, how do we think about diplomacy in a different way? That it's not just about physical strength or exerting one's power. It's what your grandfather modeled, which was build relationships, have conversations with people, do it with a sense of integrity and purpose that can then move toward peace in a way that can be more lasting and more durable. President Kennedy had the following to say, quote, "U Thant has put the world deeply in his debt." How does that resonate with you?
Yeah, I think it's, when I first read all of that, I thought it was an amazing tribute to him. And then I really wondered why he had been then kind of airbrushed out of history. I think in a way it's because we don't tend to remember the people who are the ones who seek compromise, who try to mediate, who in a principled way try to advocate moderation and a peaceful way forward. I think what he showed, and I mean, I guess in a way his secret strength was his ability, his sort of moral imagination. I think having lived in at least two very different worlds, he was able to empathize, he was able to understand the points of view of many different sides, and then act on the basis of that. It showed that leadership doesn't have to be the loudest person in the room, but can also be the person who is able to understand others' points of view and then look for, again, a peaceful way forward when everyone thinks that you have to be tough and you have to be strong and get the other side to back down.
After the break, Thant Myint-U explains the role that U Thant played in diplomacy during the Vietnam War. He also reflects on his grandfather's legacy. This is Disrupted. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. This hour, we reflect on the role of the United Nations as it celebrates the 80th anniversary of its founding. We're talking with historian Thant Myint-U about his grandfather, U Thant. U Thant was the third Secretary General of the United Nations and the first one not from Europe. He served as Secretary General from 1961 to 1971. Thant Myint-U's new book is Peacemaker, U Thant and the Forgotten Quest for a Just World. Here's more of our conversation. I think collectively our human tendency is to focus on the current moment and the current context without understanding or really addressing how we got here. What were the historical conflicts that set different terms about what, as you said, that beautiful phrase, the moral imagination, what it demands, and from whom it demands a real commitment. U Thant served as Secretary General for about 10 years. And had to navigate many different conflicts across the world during that time, keeping that center, keeping that ethical commitment to peace. And one of the conflicts that I think really showed the importance of context within conflict was Vietnam. Talk to us about the position that U Thant took during that time and what it meant for him to be in this position during that conflict.
I think for him, like for many of his colleagues from Africa and Asia especially, but others as well, the most important thing at that time was not just finishing empire in the sense of seeing through decolonization, but to create a new world of equality, including the equality of states, and to build a new international system. And their greatest fear was that independence would just be a piece of paper that the British or the French gave a country, a flag that went down, another flag that went up, and it wouldn't have meaning, that these countries would be interfered with, that the big powers from Europe or the Americans or the Russians would come in and do as they pleased on the basis of many different justifications, and that other countries would still control their economies. And so it was in the context of thinking about that, this fight for real independence and to create this new international system. And at a time when, after the Cuban Missile Crisis, it looked like the UN was the place that could really pull all of this together. President Kennedy became a big fan. He worked closely with U Thant. The Russians did as well. Vietnam got in the way. The American intervention in Vietnam, my grandfather really felt would destroy any prospect of this new world kind of coming into being. And so he said to Washington, to President Johnson and to his top aides as early as 1964, he said, if you try to go to war in Vietnam, you will lose. Take it from me. I'm from the region. You have nothing to fear of the Vietnamese unifying themselves. They don't want to be under foreigners. They don't want to be under the Chinese or the Russians or anyone else, but they will fight for their independence. And what you need me for, what you need the UN for, is to find a face-saving withdrawal from the region that will make sure that the region is pacific and is non-aligned and no threat to America. And this will maintain American prestige, that the Americans should actually embrace revolutionary change in the rest of the world, that this is in America's interest. And so he was trying to convince, and that didn't work. More than, many hundreds of thousands of people died in the years to come. And so for him, this became a real quest over many years to try to find a diplomatic solution, but increasingly to challenge Washington as well on the war.
You mentioned the word quest, and the subtitle of your book is The Forgotten Quest for a Just World. Share with us what you mean, the forgotten quest.
I think it's related to two things. I mean, one is, the founding of the UN. I think we have to respect those men and women in the 40s and early 50s who in their adult lifetimes had lived through 2 world wars that killed 80 million plus people and a Great Depression in between, and felt that we couldn't just go back to the old way of big power politics, spheres of influence, balance of power, and that something else had to be possible. And that this vision merged with another, the vision of the countries that call themselves the Afro-Asians, who felt again that the world after empire had to be different. It had to be based on equality and embrace of the UN and a new international system. And for a while, in the early 60s, late 50s, early 60s, I mean, this was going quite well. We were moving towards that different world where there was a lot of public enthusiasm, including in America, for the UN, for peace, and the idea of cooperation on development. And it was in some ways purposely undermined. I mean, it was undermined because some people wanted to go to war in Vietnam. It was undermined because some people couldn't get beyond thinking in terms of big power politics and Cold War politics. And there's a specific story around my grandfather, which I tell in the book, the different episodes, not just Vietnam, but the Six-Day War and everything else, the other conflicts at that time, which meant that there were people, institutions that wanted to forget that this was possible, that this was working, that they set up a very different way of thinking about the world. And it was in their interest to make sure there was a collective amnesia about what had happened before. And that's the story of, why our world is so fractured today. I think to understand that, we have to understand this piece of the puzzle.
I think we also have to understand why it is so challenging to think about leadership in divisive, fractured times, to think about the implications of taking on a role that seems so big, but often feels like there are no contemporaries. Your grandfather told the BBC that during that time, the Secretary General job was the loneliest job in the world. How did he navigate having so much ability and influence and still realizing that some of what he was facing felt intractable because people were so invested in that notion of supremacy and power and not moving toward peace, but moving toward being the dominant force? How did he navigate that loneliness?
I think it was tough. I'm sure it was tough. And I think going through his papers, I think one of the things that seems so remarkable to me is that he was so lonely in the sense that he was living in two very different worlds at the same time. So he was, on the 38th floor of the UN dealing with ministers, foreign ministers, presidents, prime ministers from all these different countries, many from these big power countries coming up from Washington or visiting from London or from Paris, negotiating with them. And then he would go home, and my grandmother didn't speak English. We had many Burmese friends. He would go home to a very Burmese world, and that world had almost no connection with his office life. And so he was living in two very different contexts. He had different sets of friends. So in that way, I think it was lonely. He was lonely also because he was estranged from his own government, the Burmese government. And by 1970-71, that government refused to even renew his own passport. He was under a new military dictatorship. So he was almost literally a man without a country. And the Secretary Generalship is an office that actually has no power. So it's the power of moral influence, of his ability to maintain these contacts and manage these relationships. But above all, I think he had to kind of be certain that he was acting on the basis of these UN principles, that he was acting in a principled way, and to bring public opinion along with him as much as he could. But it was incredibly frustrating. And I think towards the end, he was extremely frustrated with the inability of that vision that he and many of his colleagues had 10 years before to really materialize in a way that I think he knew was practically possible, but that there were new people, other people who were standing in the way.
Your grandfather passed away when you were younger. What did you learn about him in doing the research for this book, writing this book, that may have made you appreciate the fullness of him as a person, of the fullness of who he was in the sphere and the legacy he created? What did you learn through this research that made you see him in that fullness?
I think it's a mix of him as a human being, the things that we were just talking about now, and his character and just where he'd come from also in his life. And he was just, throughout these times, he was 10, 20 years removed from life in this very rural community in Burma. But also his place in history. And it's understanding that context, that this wasn't just an episode during the Cold War where someone at the UN tried to do something, achieved a couple of things, failed in a couple of things. It was something very different, which was that there was a world in the making that was this world after empire that wasn't just an abstract idea or the project of kind of woolly idealists. It was a really practical project to create a mechanism for peace that would build a permanent peace. And it was actually beginning to come together. And the story of why it didn't happen really centers around my grandfather's period and what he was able and not able to do. So I hope in the book, in a way, people will see much more clearly how this was pivotal, and why it wasn't just one factor or two factors, but many different things came together that both made this a very special time in terms of people being hopeful that there could be peace in the future and being very successful, but also a time when we began to turn in a very dark way towards alternative ways of thinking, many of which we still have today.
What is the piece of your grandfather's approach, his legacy, that you wish we would really reclaim today, especially because, as you said, the conflicts, the challenges that we are facing are so reminiscent of his time as Secretary General, and yet he was able to forge a path. What should we be reclaiming in this moment?
I think in 1961, when he took over, it was also a very bleak time in many ways. It was the height of the Cold War. People really thought, World War III could be around the corner. There were many other challenges as well, including the challenge of racism and battling white supremacy in Africa at the time. And I think the lesson of that time, in a way, from my book, is that change and new ideas came from very unexpected places. It didn't necessarily come from Ivy League universities or the halls of power in Washington or London or Moscow. But it came from many of these small countries. It came from ordinary people who worked at the UN at the time. And it came from people like my grandfather. And I think when we think also about the UN at this time, I think we have to realize that, the Secretary General of the UN, who right now I think enjoys a far less privileged position and well-known position than my grandfather did in the 1960s, that is still a role that could be indispensable in the future. It is the only person in the world that is chosen by the whole world to try to be a servant of peace and to be a mediator and to be the world's preeminent mediator. And I think a lesson of the 60s, going back to that time, is that there used to be this person that we could all count on to try to prevent and end wars. And I think in this time, we need to think about how to revive and strengthen that role again over the coming years.
You, in your own work, have really continued this mission, but extended it in profound ways. You have worked on 3 UN peacekeeping operations. You continue to remind us of the need to really interrogate history, but to see it as a path to peace in a very different way. How do you think about your career as not just an extension of your grandfather's legacy, as important as that is, but a charting a path for what this commitment can do? How does that show up in your own professional commitment?
I mean, I think I've always been learning, and I haven't really had a career in the sense of a single path forward. I started out, I had interned a little bit for the UN. I'd never intended on working for the UN for a long time. I did a PhD in history, so I thought of myself as a student of history and someone who would write about the history of empire in particular, which I did in a couple of books. And then I worked in these peacekeeping operations. I worked for Kofi Annan in the 2000s in New York. And then I went to Burma, where I'd never lived before. It's my parents' home country. It's obviously my grandfather's home country, and became involved in politics there and the transition from military rule. So in all of these different things, I've learned a lot of things in terms of the importance of different kinds of leadership, and also, more than anything else, the need to kind of imagine different possibilities and imagine how others might think about problems in trying to steer, again, a path towards compromise and moderation and peaceful solutions. So that's always, I guess, if there's anything, that's at the core of the kinds of things that I've thought about. And I didn't plan to write this book. I came across the archive and I thought, this is so different from what's been written about the 1960s. But it's kind of brought a lot of these pieces together for me in different ways.
I am embarrassed to admit, and yet I want to publicly admit, with all that I thought I knew about that time, with all that I thought I knew about, what was happening in other parts of the world and people's journeys into that, I did not know your grandfather's story. And it was why I was so honored when you agreed to be on this episode, because I think collectively we need to remember the everyday ways that people show up because of a commitment to justice, to peace, to global citizenship, to imagination, even when they don't get the credit for that. And I'm also curious about what your grandfather's legacy means to his people. How is he remembered in what it took to go from someone who was a school teacher, an educator in that way, to moving forward to become Secretary General? How is he remembered?
Well, it's a story that I hope will have a good ending because, when he died, I went back. It was my first trip to Burma. I was 8 years old with my parents to bury him. And his burial became very controversial because ordinary people thought of him as a hero in Rangoon. Tens of thousands of people lined up to greet his remains, his coffin, as it was being transported from the airport. And then there were demonstrations, and people were demanding a public state funeral, which the military regime at the time didn't want. It all led to violence. Dozens, if not hundreds of people were killed. And then he was buried under 6 feet of concrete without any kind of ceremony by the military regime at the time. And then he was erased there as well from the history books. And so 2 generations of young people didn't learn anything about him. And that changed only about a decade ago when he began to be taught in schools as well. And my wife and I turned his old house, which he had lived in the 50s in Burma before he went to New York, into Thant House, which is a museum about him, but it's also a place where thousands of young people, kids, students, have been able to come to learn a little bit about him, but also learn about the issues that that were most dear to him, on human rights, on peace, on interethnic tolerance and understanding, on the environment as well. So that's actually, despite all the problems in Burma and Myanmar right now, that's still open and ongoing. So that's how his legacy lives on there.
I can think of no more compelling or beautiful tribute to his legacy as an educator, as a peacemaker and leader, than to create this way for others to learn, and especially for young people to remember there is a different way. And that peace is possible when we commit to it, when we can imagine it and embrace it. And so we are grateful that you wrote this book. We are grateful that you are continuing to remind us of this. And my hope is that even in those difficult moments, we can return to your grandfather's legacy as not just a reminder, but a charge to keep moving and working for peace. Thant Myint-U is author of Peacemaker, U Thant and the Forgotten Quest for a Just World. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
After the break, a look at the threats facing the United Nations today and how the organization is planning for its future. This is Disrupted. Stay with us. Welcome back to Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. In September, the United Nations General Assembly began its 80th session. When the organization was created in 1945 after World War II, it had particular goals that included maintaining international peace and security, protecting human rights, delivering humanitarian aid, supporting sustainable development and climate action, and upholding international law. Those goals still guide the UN's actions. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres reflected on the challenges that the organization faces today. He gave those remarks in a speech on September 23rd in front of the General Assembly.
80 years on, we confront again the question our founders faced, only more urgent, more intertwined, more unforgiving. What kind of world do we choose to build together? Excellencies, we have our work cut out for us as our ability to carry out that work is being cut from us. We have entered in an age of reckless disruption and relentless human suffering. Look around. The principles of the United Nations that you have established are under siege.
Our next guest will help us understand the current work of the United Nations. Eugene Chen is Senior Fellow at the United Nations University Center for Policy Research. He's also a former UN official. Eugene, thank you for joining us on Disrupted.
Thanks so much for having me.
I want to start with what may seem like a really basic question for you, but I think many in the public don't really know what the United Nations is, what its powers are. They may know that it exists, but really not understand those nuts and bolts. Share with us then, what power does the UN have at this point in history?
Yeah, so the United Nations consists both of its member states as well as institutions that are present to basically implement the will of the member states. So in the end of the day, what the United Nations is able to accomplish is largely dependent upon the amount of support it receives from its member states. I mean, ultimately, the challenges facing the world today are really more than any single country can handle alone. And the various organizations of the United Nations system were created by member states at different points in time to help with addressing those problems, whether they range from questions of war and peace to delivery of humanitarian assistance to dealing with pandemics and public health. But they also exist to promote fundamental principles and norms so that people everywhere in the world can live with dignity and enjoy human rights.
I appreciate you making that distinction because I think often when people think about the power of the UN, they only think about military power. And what you're saying is there is a power in member states coming together to have a shared consensus, a shared basis of values and principles that can guide everything that that organization does. And at the same time, Eugene, a few weeks ago, the 80th session of the UN General Assembly started. And we heard a clip of the Secretary General saying, quote, "The principles of the United Nations that you have established are under siege." What do you think about that statement?
Yeah, we are in a period of real change and flux in the international system. As the Secretary General mentioned, and as you mentioned just now, the UN is about to enter its 80th year of existence. And over the past 80 years, much has changed in the world. We had the immediate post-war era, we had the Cold War era, post-Cold War era, 9/11, etc. But throughout all those periods, one thing has been very, very constant, which is that the United States was a strong supporter of the UN. I mean, it was pretty much the country that kind of imagined the UN into existence. But in the past 9 months, we have seen a significant shift away from that. We have, for the first time, an administration that is openly hostile to the UN and to multilateral cooperation on these global challenges. And so this is one of the greatest challenges the UN has faced. I say that, I mentioned that, this administration has been uniquely critical of the UN to the point where it's a pretty significant break from the first Trump administration, which even though it was critical of the UN, it did not go nearly as far in trying to really undermine the work of the UN. During the first Trump administration, the US, did not fully honor its financial commitments to the UN, but it still provided some part of its annual assessed contributions to the organization. But since the current administration began back in January, the United States has not made any payments to the UN, and they've also made it very clear that they oppose broad swaths of what the UN does, including its development and its human rights work. And so the UN has to grapple and contend with this really fundamental challenge to how it has operated over the last 80 years. But this is a broader kind of shift as well, away from how kind of the international order has functioned since the end of the Second World War. The idea that cooperation between countries is the best way to address some of these challenges, that idea itself is under threat now. And so the UN has to kind of find a way to better position itself given this fundamental reality in the world that we live in now.
I want to bring in this clip from President Trump during his address to the General Assembly.
What is the purpose of the United Nations? The UN has such tremendous potential. I've always said it. It has such tremendous, tremendous potential. But it's not even coming close to living up to that potential.
Eugene, what is that potential that he is speaking of that the UN is not living up to? And if the United States withdraws or retreats from supporting the UN, doesn't it then make it impossible for the UN to reach any potential? What's the potential he's referencing?
Yeah, so one of the things that we've certainly seen since Trump entered office in his second term is the United States government describing the UN in very limited terms. So when we, both in the statement that the president made during the high-level week, at the end of last month, as well as during the various confirmation hearings in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee for Mike Waltz and other ambassadors, we've heard the administration say that the UN needs to focus on what the administration calls its core purpose in maintaining international peace and security, and get out of the business of working on divisive human rights and development issues, which promote agendas that the administration does not favor, including what it describes as DEI activities in the UN system and support for Palestine and Palestinian rights. So I think what the president is basically saying is that the potential that he sees is as the UN as an organization that can better support what he sees as the priority, strengthening American security, American prosperity, etc. And so I think what we can expect, certainly over the course of the remaining years of President Trump's term, is that the U.S. will most likely engage opportunistically with the UN and with a broader international order at large, using it when convenient and ignoring or obstructing it in other circumstances.
Gene, most people, most Americans are not paying attention to the nuances of what's happening. I will admit that as someone who thinks that I'm, fairly involved and up to date in what's happening, to hear you recap those last 9 months are things that I think we are so overwhelmed and so bombarded with information, we forget what happened in June. Sometimes we move through the world as if there are not two major wars happening right now, one related to Russia's war and invasion in Ukraine, and the other, as you have mentioned, is Israel's war against Hamas in Gaza. Those seem like so major of conflicts. And most people have said, I go through my day. Why should we be involved if those countries can't figure it out? Why, and by we I mean the United States, why should we be involved? Or why not let the United Nations deal with those conflicts because they are so big instead of drawing the United States in? But at the same time, Eugene, I hear you saying the United States is choosing the terms of some of those interventions or those possibilities based on those very transactional ideas of what is direct benefit to the U.S. What do you see in the short-term future? What will be the role of the UN in those two major wars and conflicts that have global implications, but also, I think, implications for the United States? What's the path for the UN?
Yeah, so one of the things that we have certainly seen over the course of the last few years since Secretary General Antonio Guterres entered office in 2017 is a retreat away from the business of peacemaking by the UN. If you look at the past 80 years, most of the Secretaries Generals in the past, starting from the second Secretary General, Dag Hammarskjöld, were very, very involved in diplomacy, peacemaking, ending conflicts, preventing conflicts, shuttle diplomacy, that type of business. They felt that peacemaking was core to the functions of a Secretary General. Antonio Guterres, however, has not seen that as being so central to his role. And so during the course of his tenure, those examples of mediation that the UN has engaged in have actually not been about ending conflicts themselves, but rather dealing with some of the spillover effects. So, for example, a few years ago, the UN was very engaged in this Black Sea grain initiative that allowed for the release of grain from Ukraine, in the midst of the war. Because one of the things that's really important to note now is that, because everything is so interconnected, even though, we may not be directly affected by the fighting in Ukraine from the Russian invasion, the disruption of grain supplies and sunflower oil and things like that has ripple effects throughout the entire global economy. We also saw a lot of these supply shocks during the pandemic. And so the UN has been really involved in dealing with some of these spillover effects. One of the things I think we should be really focused on is actually in the next year, the UN is actually going to be electing a new Secretary General. And so what role the UN will be playing on some of these key issues will really depend on the type of person who gets elected and what their vision for the role of the UN in this changing global order might be. And so in the next few months, we're going to start seeing member states nominating candidates for Secretary General. And then hopefully by this time next year, we will have a new Secretary General presenting a vision and ready to kind of begin office in January 2027.
It feels, Eugene, like this is a real inflection point for the UN, for the future of that body, but also for the role that it will have in the rest of the world. What are you looking toward, or what are you focusing on as you think about this process over the next year of selecting a new Secretary General? What should we be focusing on?
Yeah. So I think in the Secretary General selection process, there's a lot of different things that various people will look for. For me, I think the two most important characteristics of effective Secretary General in the selection process are, number one, the ability to very clearly articulate a vision for the direction of the UN. Like what is the international order headed towards? And what is the role of the UN? How can the UN make things better for people and for countries in kind of this changing global order? The ability to really properly articulate that and to get member state buy-in around that will be really key for success. But the second aspect is that candidates for the Secretary General will also need to be able to properly balance the interests of the permanent members of the Security Council. And this is because the UN Charter in Article 97 very clearly specifies that the Secretary General has to be appointed by the General Assembly upon the recommendation of the Security Council. So in essence, the Security Council acts as the gatekeeper for candidates, and the General Assembly more or less has more of a rubber stamp kind of approval over whoever is able to secure the support of the Security Council. Unfortunately, this also means that Security Council members have a veto over candidates for Secretary General. And in the past, this has kind of necessitated candidates for Secretary General making promises to the various permanent members of the Security Council. For example, in the appointment of senior officials. So I think one of the things that we'll have to keep an eye out for in the next year are what are the types of deals that some of the candidates who will be announced in the coming months, what might they be kind of discussing with the permanent members in order to kind of secure the support of the Security Council during that first phase of the selection process.
Gene, I have to tell you that as I was preparing for this conversation with you, I felt so overwhelmed by the possibilities of what could go wrong, of what's happening in the world, because it feels so heavy. And I really appreciate that you have reminded us to never doubt the power of the human imagination, the power of invention and reinvention, and the possibility that comes with people saying, we want and deserve better. And we're going to move toward that, not just for ourselves, but for those yet to come. So I appreciate you and your work for reminding us of that. Eugene Chen is Senior Fellow at the United Nations University Center for Policy Research. He's also a former UN official. Thank you, Eugene.
Thank you so much for having me. This was such a pleasure.
Disrupted is produced by Kevin Chang Barnum, Robin Doyon-Aiken, Erica McIntosh, and Meg Fitzgerald. This episode was also produced by Lily Tyson. Our interns are V. Zhuang and Tale Ricketson. You can listen to all the previous episodes of Disrupted by finding us wherever you get your podcast. And you can listen for new episodes every Friday at 9 a.m. From Connecticut Public Radio, this is Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. Thanks for listening.